all the people in the United States have tested positive for forever chemicals. Now, some of the disease they cause, forever chemicals cause, they disrupt calcium levels in the blood, causing increase in arteriosclerosis and blood clots. They cause problems with cholesterol and liver and kidney damage. They're attached to proteins and they get circulated all around the body. They easily cross the blood-brain barrier, accumulate in the hippocampus, and cause Alzheimer's. 1 out of 3 people over the age of 80 is going to die from Alzheimer's disease, scheduled to go to 2 out of 3 in the next 80 years.
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Wendy Myers. Welcome to the Myers Detox podcast. And on this show, we talk about everything related to heavy metal and chemical detoxification and how it harms your health. Today, we have Dr. Bill McGraw on the show, and he's going to be talking about how to detox aluminum and forever chemicals. These are very specific detoxes, and Bill is very, very knowledgeable. He's written many books on detoxification, a wealth of knowledge, very detailed statistics, and where you find this stuff, where we're getting it into our bodies, specific supplements and methods you need to detox these toxins that are ubiquitous in our environment. Almost every single person has these toxins in their body. So it's very important to listen to the show and follow some of the recommendations that Dr. McGraw has. So we're talking about exactly where we find aluminum and how to detox it, how we need to use silica to detox aluminum, where you find silica in the diet, in water, etc., why we need to use sweat therapy to get aluminum out of our body. We also talk about Rife technology and how he uses Rife technology, specifically Spooky 2, to help facilitate detoxification in the body. We also talk about forever chemicals, so where we find them, how they're in the food wrappers and processed foods, and how these forever chemicals are used in, essentially the food wrappers is where we find them. In the nonstick pans, we find them in fire retardants on furniture and mattresses. I mean, they're just in so many different places. And in the water we drink, we get that's one of the main sources of forever chemicals and water. So we talk about what kind of water filtration system that you need to remove these from the main source, how they're coming into our body. So tune in today. This is a really, really important show. And I know you guys listening to the Myers Detox podcast are worried about your body burden of toxins. So I created a quiz that you can take at heavymetalsquiz.com. It takes a couple of seconds and answer a few lifestyle questions, and you'll get your relative body burden results. And then after that, you get a free video series about how to detox your body. And I answer a lot of your frequently asked questions in a video series about how to detox your body and answering all of your questions that people have typically when they're starting out detoxing. So check it out at heavymetalsquiz.com. So our guest today, Dr. Bill McGraw. So he's a multidisciplinary research scientist working in the fields of agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, coral reef ecology, and naturopathic medicine. And he began studying medicine because of a healing crisis he was experiencing that began in 2010. He couldn't find a doctor or therapist to help him, so he became a doctor of medicine to heal himself, and medicine became a real passion of his to help others do the same. And since then, he's become a very adept healer with many full cancer cures, detox successes, and countless resolutions of many chronic diseases for a variety of people from many different countries. And Dr. Bill knows that the cure for all chronic diseases can be found using Rife technology, supplementing for mineral deficiencies, and removing toxins from the human body. And he continues to educate in all of his chosen fields, and he achieves better than a 90% success rate in healing people from chronic diseases. You can learn more about Dr. Bill and his work at drbillmcgraw.com. Bill, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Wendy. It's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the health field.
Oh boy. About 15 years ago, I was suffering from insomnia while working in South Africa on a multi-million-dollar aquaculture project. And I went to see a doctor about it, and he gave me a prescription drug. And I went to another doctor, and he gave me another drug and so on. So that went on for years, and it didn't really fix my insomnia. I just kept moving on to more prescription drugs, and I accumulated a bag of them. And eventually, the insomnia turned into anxiety, where I'd wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and blood pressure 210 over 120, and end up having to take benzodiazepine to sleep every night. And the last MD I went to basically told me he didn't want to ever see me again. He had no more drugs for me. So I made the rounds with the whatever naturopathic doctors I could find, and they hooked me up to machines, and gave me readouts of all the things wrong with me, sold me these expensive herbal supplement stuff, and nothing worked. And eventually I just had enough and realized I had to fix myself. So I began studying medicine. This was like 15 years ago, and I just couldn't stop. I fixed myself by just supplementing with potassium and magnesium, which was causing my anxiety, and eventually the same thing, adding some other minerals because I was severely mineral deficient, and the anxiety was a physiological response to mineral deficiency. And then I did a hair test, figured out I had heavy metals, and did a mercury detox, and eventually, solved my problem, and then continued studying alternative medicine, and went on to get involved more and more, and became a doctor of medicine, and began treating people full time. And I got into Rife technology and heavy into detoxification because that's what fixed me. And I began fixing other people. And now I work on just about every kind of disease you can possibly think of that's chronic.
Right, fantastic. Yeah. And today I want to talk to you about aluminum toxicity and forever chemicals. It's something I haven't really done a show like specifically on that. So tell us about kind of the prevalence of forever chemicals in our environment.
Yeah, they tend to be located around areas of high population, a lot of industry. They're pretty localized. The interesting point, which people probably don't know, is they were developed in the 1930s. There's 4,700 compounds worth over $100 billion for forever chemicals, also known as perfluoroalkyl substances. The reason that they're used so very much is because they add really good durability, stain resistance, and they're found and used in just a variety of products such as cosmetics and firefighting equipment, clothing, especially outdoor clothing, and processed food packaging. They're just more and more being used all over the place, and more found in the environment all over the place. And they're incredibly toxic. As people know, DuPont paid $670 million to people who claimed they got cancer from forever chemicals in 2012. So it kind of reminds me of glyphosate in that respect. The reason they can't break down in the environment is because of strong carbon-fluorine bonds. And the only way to break these bonds down is when the forever chemicals are exposed to a certain bacteria, they're called anaerobic bacteria, that exist without oxygen. They can break that bond, but it takes a long time. And so right now there's 200 people in the United States drinking forever chemicals in their water every single day. That's one of the commonalities with aluminum. They just seem to be really in so many water sources. And the other main sources are processed foods, fish, believe it or not, much like mercury. The larger the fish you have, the more forever chemicals. And so they get into our bodies from a number of different ways. They're hard to break down in the environment, and they're really hard to get out of our body, more so than even as much as heavy metals like mercury, and certainly a lot harder to get out of the body than aluminum. So 97% of all the people in the United States have tested positive for forever chemicals. Now, some of the disease forever chemicals cause, they disrupt calcium levels in the blood, causing increase in arteriosclerosis and blood clots. They cause problems with cholesterol and liver and kidney damage. They're attached to proteins, and they get circulated all around the body. They easily cross the blood-brain barrier, accumulate in the hippocampus, and cause Alzheimer's. 1 out of 3 people over the age of 80 is going to die from Alzheimer's disease, scheduled to go to 2 out of 3 in the next 80 years. So forever chemicals also accumulate in breast milk. So a child could be accumulating forever chemicals even just being born as they cross the placental barrier, much like aluminum. And so then the child gets more through milk samples exposed to certain types of processed foods, and they accumulate more and more. Forever chemicals accumulate predominantly in the lungs, and there they contribute to inflammation, pulmonary edema. They're also linked to increased inflammation in the lungs together with graphene oxide and vaccines. They're endocrine disruptors. They interfere with testicular development. They cause immune suppression. So there's so many different things, so many different avenues that they cause so many different problems. Now, getting rid of them, which is mostly what people listen to me for these days, it's really hard. There is a compound called cholestyramine, which you can take, which binds bile acids, which are attached to forever chemicals in the gallbladder, and help remove them out through the gastrointestinal tract, preventing hepatic portal vein recirculation, like a lot of toxins, much like mercury. And this is one of the ways that you can get rid of forever chemicals, is by taking this compound, which I think requires a prescription for. Now, most people are going to ask me right after that, well, isn't there something more natural we can take? And of course, there usually always is. And you can actually eat beets. I don't know if you're familiar with Robert von Starbucker, who advocates the mini beet protocol, but this is a matter of drinking beet juice with carrot juice, and then also eating apples. And it does the same sort of thing. It just binds the bile acids attached to forever chemicals, and prevents them from going through the internal hepatic circulation, which is a normal avenue of digesting fats that we normally do all the time when we eat fats. And so instead of recirculating around through the liver, you're going to pass it down through the gastrointestinal tract once it's bound to things like beets or beet juice or asparagus or okra. So it turns out that the story is a lot of the story is the same in terms of when we eat a lot of organic vegetables, and they contain certain types of compounds which are naturally found, and certain types of fibers. Even in apples, you'll find pectin, which helps us bind heavy metals. We pass them out through the gastrointestinal tract. So these are going to be one of the hardest things, I think, to get out of the human body, because from reading studies, there was a study published in 2010 which determined that sweat therapies and zeolites were completely ineffective for removing forever chemicals. So this is why 98% of the people in the United States test positive for forever chemicals. They're so incredibly difficult to get rid of.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of chemicals like that the body has never seen before. The body doesn't know how to break it down. I think there's a lot more problems with various chemicals in addition to the over 40 plus forever chemicals that we have in our environment.
Right.
Do you do any like bioenergetic technologies or frequencies to facilitate detoxification of forever chemicals as well?
I think so. Yeah, we have a terrain protocol that we do through Spooky 2 program and Rife technology, which I think predominantly is an extractor of tissues. So it's good if you run that terrain protocol through remote technology using quantum entanglement, and then increase sweat therapies and use vitamin C, which prevents oxidation of tissues and keeps free radicals in check, while potentially taking low amounts of glutathione either through a transdermal patch or small amounts throughout the day in liposomal form, so that you're binding continually toxins at a low level over time, rather than just, I hear some of my clients who've done these weekend detoxes and they just suffer horribly for it, because, as they always say, it's a marathon, it's not a race. And so it's more like a slow and steady continual detox that you have to get rid of things like this that are hard to get rid of. And then, of course, always the first stage of detox is to prevent the additional input of these forever chemicals, which is all about knowledge. Where do you find them? How do they get into your body? And of course, if they're in so many water samples in so many places in the United States, especially around industrial areas and areas of high population, you really have to have activated carbon and ion exchange resin cartridge filters, like zero water filter that you can buy off Amazon or other companies, and continually filter your water so that the only water you're intaking is really good filtered water that doesn't contain more of these chemicals. So it's kind of useless detoxing and getting into detox protocols when you just continually taking in more junk. So it means the elimination of processed foods and being aware that, larger carnivorous fish contain more of these chemicals as well as mercury, obviously. And, the knowledge and the detox is a total package that you have to engage in if you want to be successful at living a long, healthy life and avoiding chronic disease and all the toxification that you can get into when you tend to ignore these things.
Yeah. And even if you take like every measure available to you, that you almost live in a detox bubble, which, some people can certainly get into. I was certainly there at one point. But even if you take every measure precaution possible, you're still exposed. I mean, it's absolutely impossible to avoid just living in modern life. And you want to relax a little bit. Also, I think that I think these days I try not to get too fanatical about every tiny little thing, because it is hard to avoid this stuff. And you just, bottom line, you have to live a detox lifestyle. You have to work on getting this stuff out of your body. And I love that you use Rife technology. I use a Spooky 2 Rife myself and use it for detoxification. I used it today on my daughter for a wart. I mean, it has like 50,000 different programs. It's so versatile. And we're going to do another podcast on that as well. We've done previous podcasts on that as well, if you want to check those out.
Absolutely.
But let's talk is there any more about the forever chemicals you want to add, or do you want to move on to talking about aluminum?
I think that the only thing left to say is that this is something that is going to continue in terms of abundance and the diversity of different products and foods and so on that you're going to find forever chemicals. It's used in so many wrappers and so many different things because it just extends the durability and the sustainability of products and makes them cheaper and last longer and more profitable. And I think it's just going to be a constant, continual adhering to looking at different things as to what you put on your body or in your body, or what you're exposed to. Unfortunately, I think it's just going to become more prevalent and more requiring continual cognition of the whole situation the way it is.
Can you speak to forever chemicals and their contribution to the obesity epidemic at all?
In terms of it's like an autoimmune disorder that they create. It's just the amount of inflammation. I think inflammation is stored in fat cells. And I think when you engage in poor nutrition, such as processed foods, and you have mineral deficiencies and you have, poor digestion, I think it creates more cravings for more sugars and more of the same type of processed foods. And when you're eating all these processed foods and foods that have poor nutrition, you just keep craving them because you never really are sated in terms of minerals and proper fats. And then you create poor cell membranes and you get into this spiral of continuing on and satisfying the toxicities. It's sort of like a small amount of toxicity requires more and more to sustain itself, and it creates cravings, much like candida in the body would. Candida creates its own cravings, and so there's always that, if you have this mineral deficiency, you probably have more of a sugar craving or an alcohol craving or a tobacco craving. And if you never really satisfy the body's requirements for good nutrition, it creates this avenue of continually going down the wrong path in terms of making poor choices with the things that we do, poor lifestyle choices, and then poor nutritional choices as well.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was overweight and I was having like tons and tons of food cravings, like just voracious salt and vinegar potato chip cravings, because my body was just crying out for minerals, and the potato chips were just a vehicle for the salt. But you just think it's the chips, that you just can't put down the chips. You don't have any willpower, but
Sure.
that's not the case. It's just your body.
Right.
Biology overcomes willpower every time. Can you talk a little bit about the prevalence of aluminum in our environment and where we find that?
Oh, wow. If we go all the way back to the story of aluminum is quite a bit different than forever chemicals. When we separate aluminum from aluminum ore, we go all the way back to the 1880s, and currently there's something like 70 million tons of pure aluminum produced, which produces 150 million tons of waste, which is not non-recyclable. Once that happened, aluminum was then available and became cheaper and cheaper. And then industry began putting it in a lot of different things. So one of the things that happened is we use, or I say we, but domestic water treatment uses aluminum sulfate to basically make water clearer. It settles out solids. So when we do that, what happens is there's always a trace level of aluminum in the water left. And so now more than 50% of all tap water sources in the United States contain at least 0.1 milligrams per liter of aluminum. And as it turns out, it is the biggest source of aluminum in our bodies and the biggest cause of Alzheimer's. So that's one of the commonalities between aluminum and forever chemicals is they both get past the blood-brain barrier, accumulate in the hippocampus, and contribute to the problem with Alzheimer's. Obviously, they're both in water too, but they both can be removed with activated carbon ion exchange. But most people just don't realize that, just don't have that knowledge. This sort of knowledge isn't put forth on major media. So where do you get it? I mean, it's really a matter of following alternative news and listen to Detox podcasts, and where you're going to pick up this information repeatedly, talking about ways of removing, ways of detox. Knowledge is power. Avoiding the toxins is the first stage of detox. So it's a matter of drinking filtered water and removing the aluminum and forever chemicals in your water samples, so you don't have that continual input and continual accumulation, where it leads to later on creating problems in older age, where maybe your organs don't function as well. There's accumulation of toxins, and a threshold is reached where you just don't have the neurotransmission. You just don't have the neural tissue available for proper cognition, and you develop problems with Alzheimer's and mobility and autoimmune disorders and arthritis and so on, and mineral deficiencies. And then there's broken hips and kidney damage, because 80% of a lot of heavy metals are stored in the kidney. And you get into this old age syndrome where you just, it's so much more difficult to detox. So it's so much better to gain the knowledge and prevent the accumulation, engage detox, and just prevent the input of those toxins, be able to continually detox them, these toxins on a regular basis, rather than dealing with the crisis older. And as you age and get older, it's much more difficult than to handle this old age chronic disease crisis. That's my experience in treating people for the past 8 years here in Panama. And predominantly, my clients are predominantly retired. So that's all I deal with. 95% of my clients are retirees. So the number one source is aluminum, and I think you'll find it more than 50% of all tap water samples. Easy to correct if you're just running through carbon filters with ion exchange resins. The next one would be aluminum cookware. Now, I talk to my clients who are predominantly from Canada and United States, South Africa, and more modern countries, and they'll tell me, well, of course we don't use aluminum cookware. But you'd be freaked out if you came to Panama and went downtown. The second largest city in Panama is David, and you went into the department store, and you would see an entire floor full of aluminum cookware. And the first time I saw this, I was freaked out. I had to take pictures and ask a lot of questions, of course, all in Spanish. But the idea here is that aluminum cookware is prevalent and everywhere in Panama. So people are constantly taking in aluminum by using cookware. How much? 125 milligrams of pure aluminum per serving of food when using aluminum cookware.
Eesh,
and I'm talking everything from coffee makers to regular pots and pans to like slicers made of aluminum and forks and spoons and just about anything you can imagine, lids and containers. And I really got freaked out. Of course, it's be such a monumental task to go out and educate everyone and tell them not to use aluminum cookware, because aluminum is just so cheap and durable and user friendly. It doesn't rust. It's so lightweight. It melts at such a lower temperature compared to these other metals. So you'll find artisanal people making all these things out of aluminum, and then people using them, having them around the house. And, that's how they take aluminum into their bodies at 125 milligrams per day. It's just an insane amount. Anyone who's using aluminum cookware regularly is going to develop Alzheimer's. There's just no way around it.
Yeah.
Even if you're detoxing all the time, you're still going to get Alzheimer's from cookware.
Yeah. I mean, I've noticed too, in not testing clients, that people that use aluminum cookware, when they have sky high aluminum, always they're using aluminum cookware. And it's in the restaurants too. When you go to low-end restaurants, even the
Oh
US,
yeah. Oh
they're
yeah.
using cheap disposable aluminum cookware, even if you're not at home.
Yeah, yeah, that's disturbing because the average person on the go, continually busy, is just going to be consuming a lot of aluminum and these quick and ready foods or the quick and ready ingredients using, like you said, cheap cookware made of aluminum. Why? Because it's just everywhere. It's easy, it's fast, it's reliable, durable, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you just don't have that knowledge, you just don't have that concern, you're going to end up as being one or two out of, one or two people, 50% or more, 75% of the people over the age of 80 who are going to die of Alzheimer's. The number one cause of death for retirees is going to be Alzheimer's. And if you just don't have that knowledge, you're going to be in a lot of trouble because once, as you know, I'm preaching to the choir here. It's just so difficult to get out of the body once you have such high concentrations and the damage is done to the neural tissue. And once you have, the moderate forms of Alzheimer's where you need assisted living, at that point in time, aluminum is just so difficult to remove and it takes such a major effort. And it's just such a major task to try and remove all that aluminum and allow the nerve tissue to repair itself and the neural fibrillary tangles to untangle and neural transmission to continue at a pace where people can lead a normal life of being responsible for themselves and daily activities and so on. It's really daunting.
Yeah, I really like that point you made that the older you get, the more difficult it is to detox. And it's so true. I mean, people's metabolism slows down. The heavy metals and toxins are interfering in people's ability to detox, interfering in
Right.
liver and kidney and other,
Oh, yeah.
other ways that we detox. People don't realize that they need to start detoxing early so that while their body is working well, while their detox pathways are working really well, not waiting till they get a diagnosis, not waiting till they're ill or fatigued. It's much harder to turn that ship around.
Oh, absolutely. Another source of aluminum is in antacids, 500 milligrams of aluminum per antacid tablet. And I think it's something like 25-30% of all the people in the United States are going to have some problem with acid reflux or overproduction of acid in the stomach or improper digestion, where they're just gobbling down these sugar-coated colored tablets all the time, and they're getting 500 milligrams per tablet. And even on the package itself, it'll say, of course, in a super small print, you got to get a magnifying glass. It'll say that, don't eat too many of these tablets. You're going to develop some form of dementia. And it's on there. So it boggles the mind. Why would people, first off, why would the companies do this to people? Secondly, why wouldn't people just, read that package and say, oh my God, look at this. We need to do something about it. And it's often involved in detoxification and supplementing with proper minerals that brings about an end to acid reflux. But yeah, antacids, if you're eating them regularly and you suffer from acid reflux, it's a guaranteed absolute assumption you're likely going to develop dementia and Alzheimer's. Of course, the package will tell you openly, right? So that's another big no-no. And the fourth one I'd have to say is processed foods. If you're leading a pretty good life in terms of being fit and engaging in sweat therapies, having a good diet, proper supplementation, you may be taking 5 to 10 milligrams of aluminum in your diet every day. It's the third most common element in the Earth's crust, normally bound to silica. But if you're eating processed foods, for instance, one of the biggest sources of aluminum in processed foods is cheese on frozen pizzas. A lot of people would say, huh? But yeah, they put aluminum and aluminum compounds in these processed foods just to make them easier in processing. So frozen pizzas, the cheese contains aluminum to make it easier to process and put on the pizza. But any kind of powdered processed food, so your pancake mixes and your cake mixes, often contain some type of aluminum compound as an anti-caking agent or something in the processing that makes it easier to use. And every time you're eating these processed foods, you're taking in more and more aluminum. So that's another big avenue of aluminum into our body, is just processed food. And when you're studying this stuff like we do for decades, you figure out, well, wait a minute, this is the same thing over and over. Avoiding processed foods is a big one because processed foods just contain all this garbage. And it's cheap and easy. Yeah. But you pay a price for it later on if you're overdoing it, relying on processed junk all the time, and you just don't get the organic vegetables, which help you detox and provide good nutrition and prevent, as you mentioned, these cravings that people get because their bodies are starving. They're eating all this high calorie carb stuff, the sugar loaded junk, and they're just not getting good nutrition. So they have more cravings and they eat more junk. And it's just this endless revolving door, unfortunately. So processed foods are just so bad all the way around. Now, most people ask me, what about aluminum cans? And what about this and that? If you're using aluminum foil just to cover foods and put it in the fridge, that's fine. According to the research I've read over many years, it seems to be fine. It's when you're cooking with aluminum and using acid compounds, and the aluminum gets exposed to the acid compounds or the heat, it tends to mobilize the aluminum into the food, and then you take it into your body. Otherwise than that, aluminum cans, not that bad. It's about 0.5 milligrams of aluminum per liter, and the average person taking in like 8 or 10 milligrams of aluminum per day. So it's not that bad, surprisingly. Antiperspirants is another source, but generally speaking, aluminum doesn't penetrate the skin very well, so it's a minor source, although you can get exposed to 70 milligrams of aluminum per application of antiperspirant. And of course, they make, no aluminum antiperspirants. They're readily available on different websites, and they work just as well. I use them all the time. And then some other food sources might be tea. Tea sometimes contains aluminum and more aluminum if it's grown on acidic soils, because the aluminum will get absorbed by certain types of plants. It will attach it to oxalate because aluminum is just toxic to everything. So bacteria and plants and animals and us and you name it, aluminum just has no function in the human body. It's just all the way toxic, and nothing really wants it, unfortunately, besides industry and some mean processed foods, and that's about it. And outside of that, I'd have to say food containers. Sometimes food containers, especially with acid drinks, can build up decent amounts of aluminum in the liquid, and you can get about 16 milligrams of aluminum per liter of liquid that you're consuming. And sometimes foods, 50% of all agricultural soils are grown on acid soils. And so what happens is when that happens, more aluminum is made mobile in the soil, and the plants tend to absorb the aluminum. They form the oxalate with the aluminum to keep it bound in a compound form, and then you eat the oxalate, which is inflammatory, and then you consume the aluminum, which is inflammatory and has a tendency to accumulate in the body. And so that tends to be a problem. But 85% of all aluminum that you take into your body, according to research studies, accumulates in the brain. And that's predominantly in the hippocampus. And that's the major contributor to the Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's why we're seeing such high rates of not only Alzheimer's, but other forms of dementia as well, and Parkinson's, and so many other, health issues that just devastate families, and people don't realize they're, caught in the early stages, they are reversible by removing these toxins that are promoting them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the answer for aluminum is simple. It's called silica. Silica is like the second biggest element in the Earth's crust, and aluminum is the third. Silica and aluminum have a thing going on. They bind to each other in a compound that just is very stable. Well, you can do the same thing that nature does, and that is bind aluminum with silica. So if you went on the internet and said, well, how do I detox from aluminum? A cursory search might tell you just eat more green beans. And it's actually true. Green beans contain 2.5 milligrams of silica per 100 grams, and the absorption is 50%. So when we're talking about, eating something and obtaining nutrition, first we talk about the amount of milligrams per gram of food or per 100 grams of whatever you're eating. And the second most important thing is the percent absorption. So you could, for instance, maybe have, you could eat mussels, which contains silica, like about 10 milligrams per 100 grams of mussels that you eat, but the absorption rate is 5.5%. So you're not really benefiting from the silica that you're taking in by eating mussels because it's just not absorbed by the body. However, going back to green beans, you're talking 2.5 milligrams per 100 grams, and the percent absorption is 50%. So you're really getting the benefit of the silica, by eating the green beans. So again, it's going to come back to organic vegetables. The same thing for the forever chemicals. You're going to eat certain types of organic vegetables which bind the toxins. We might be bile acids, but for us, if we're talking about aluminum, we're talking about silica binding the aluminum and passing it out, this time predominantly through the kidneys, through the urine. Okay, so that's the one type of food is the green beans. The others, surprisingly, would be grains. So whole oats would contain 270 milligrams per 100 grams of silica. So silica at 278 milligrams per 100 grams of food, and it's 49% absorbable. The barley, 109 milligrams per 100 grams, and about the same, 49% absorbable. Potatoes, 93 milligrams per 100 grams, 21% absorbable. So, even in certain types of beers, such as Indian Pale Ale, it contains a lot of silica, high in barley. That silica gets transferred into the liquid beer, and it's actually a good way to detox from aluminum, believe it or not. And of course, that silica, as most minerals, are located in the skin and the hull of the grain and so on. So you really have to go with whole oats or whole grains or eat the skin of the potato to obtain the nutrition of the minerals, such as silica, which are going to bind the aluminum and carry it out of the body. So again and again and again, it comes back to a good diet, avoiding the toxins from the processed food. At the same time, you're detoxing by including the organic vegetables, maybe some good whole grains if you're not overtly allergic to gluten, and potatoes, the skins of potatoes. So that's some of the food sources. Now, the other huge thing is silica in water. And we'd have to go back a couple decades where that first came out in the literature. They started talking about silica in certain types of water in blue zones where people didn't develop dementia. There was like 75% decrease in Alzheimer's in certain areas that didn't have processed foods, that had people that had a good diet, and there was silica in the water sources that they were consuming every day, and it bound the aluminum. And it added nutrition. It made more pliable arteries because silica is really important to the elasticity of our arteries. So they didn't have heart attacks. They didn't have arteriosclerosis. They didn't have Alzheimer's and dementia. So these were like Garden of Edens where, scientists went in and said, well, where are the people that have dementia? Well, we don't have any. Wait a minute. What do you mean you don't have any? And they began studying these areas and they find, well, yeah, early on, National Geographic picked up the story and said, well, they have good family relationships and they don't eat a lot of garbage. Yeah, that's true. But later on, Dr. Dennis Krauss goes back into the blue zones, measuring the silica in the water, and he found out that there was an increase in blue zone effect as you increase the amount of silica in the water sources. So the more silica that you had in the water, the more health benefit there was, and then the less disease, so much so that it became startling and just mind-boggling. For instance, there's like 1 in 4 chance of living past 100 if you live outside the blue zone. So in other words, you're 4 times as likely to live past 100 if you live in a blue zone. And these are areas, as I look at my map here, I would say like Nicoya, Costa Rica, an out-of-the-way place, Sardinia Island, Italy, Ikaria Island in Greece, Okinawa Island in Japan. Yeah, a lot of islands. In other words, they don't have fast food. There's not industry. They're eating, organic fruits and vegetables and so on. And so when that happens and you have silica in the water, people don't develop disease. 80% increase in arteriosclerosis if you live someplace like the United States compared to the blue zone. 5 times higher chance of being affected by heart disease, 7 times higher chance of developing prostate cancer if you live in the United States compared to living in the blue zone. So when I read this and I read the research papers and I read the books and it all concurred to this fact, I thought, wow, this is crazy. How do I apply that to people that are looking, to get that blue zone effect without moving to Okinawa, Japan, and maybe your Japanese is rough and you don't want to do that. The bottom line is there are certain silica waters. Fiji water is one. There are other waters that have silica in a natural form. And if you just take your magnifying glass and have a looky-loo on the bottled water, you'll figure out whether or not it has silica. Now, the other idea is just to make like a synthetic silica water known as silicate. And this, you just go onto YouTube, look up Dr. Dennis Krause, Krause with the C, and he'll tell you how to make a water. You can make up like 5 gallons at a time. I do, and I sell it to my clients very cheaply. And then you add sodium silicate to water, a little small amount, and it's heated up and water becomes soluble, and you pour it into another batch of water, and then you add a certain amount of sodium bisulfite, I believe, and then you add a certain amount of sodium bicarbonate, just a tiny 1/8 teaspoon full per certain amount of water, and then you're adding minerals, and you're making this silica water, which you're drinking 3 times a day. Now, I presented this to my clients who have high aluminum based on hair tests, and of course, the first thing these people ask me is, well, how much do I have to drink before I get problems that I have? And so what happens is typically within 3 months, there are research papers that state that if you drink this water 3 times a day, 8 ounces at a shot, morning, noon, and night, that you'll significantly decrease the amount of aluminum in your body while significantly increasing cognitive ability in someone who's affected by Alzheimer's. And I've shown that in just a couple of people that had high aluminum concentrations in probably preliminary stages of Alzheimer's. So this is a real thing you find in the research in published peer-reviewed scientific journals, also in the book by Dr. Dennis Krause, who talks about the blue zones and all the research papers. In my book called Aluminum Detox, an Easy Solution, I took all these books and research papers, summarized it into a 100-page, easy-to-read book, and I tell you all how to go about removing aluminum, decreasing the symptoms of Alzheimer's, and overcoming the chronic disease.
I love it. I love it because aluminum, it's so prevalent in people today. And even if they do heavy metals tests, it doesn't always show.
That's right.
There's some labs for hair testing doesn't show very well. It doesn't always show well in urine. It doesn't really show in stool, but
That's right.
everyone has it. I mean, it's impossible to avoid. So my caution to people is that they do heavy metals testing and the aluminum is low, there's no aluminum, don't be fooled. It's in your body. It's just not coming out right now.
Right. So in other words, if you're getting a hair test and there's no aluminum in there and you still have, symptoms of brain fog or aches and pains or some of the problems associated with aluminum toxicity, it will take, as you know, it will take a certain amount of detoxing of the organs to bring the heavy metals out of the organs or out through the brain, through the blood-brain barrier into the blood, which is then the highway to eliminate the heavy metals to the gastrointestinal tract bound to silica. If we're talking heavy metals, mercury bound to glutathione, which the body naturally produces, but in lesser amounts if you have inflammatory conditions. So that's when people start detoxing, is when they start picking up the aluminum and some of the heavy metals in the blood through the hair test. And of course, you remember Dr. Andrew Cutler, who was promoting the idea of deranged mineral transport. And he said that if you have minerals in your hair test that are up and down and all over the place and not in the recommended range, it's likely due to heavy metal toxicity in the organs, preventing the utilization, absorption, and transfer of the good metals. And this was an indication of heavy metal toxicity, which you tended not to see in the hair test until you began the detox. It came out into the blood, and then the hair test would pick it up. Oftentimes, if you overdid it, as I did 10 years ago, you can develop increased symptoms of toxicity during the detox process. And then, of course, you get worse before you get better. I guess it's complicated.
Yeah, people don't like that. They don't want to feel worse. They want to do a protocol to get better than feel worse. But, that's kind of, it can be part of the program and getting better. There's not always an upward trajectory improvement in symptoms, what people want, but there are ways to manage, many, many, many ways to manage detox symptoms. So let's talk a little bit about is there any other ways besides silica to go about detoxing aluminum?
I always start off, I developed a detox protocol after studying this stuff for 15 years, and that's always sweat therapies. I studied sweat therapies. I wrote a chapter in my Mercury book, and I was just so taken with it because it does such wonderful things. The first thing it does is that it will level out the toxins in the blood. So if there's higher aluminum in the blood, you're going to get higher levels in the sweat and vice versa. if you engage the detoxing too aggressively, you will bind the toxins in the blood to the point where the body will then throw out more from the organs. And there could be too much. There's a recirculation, redistribution. You get sicker. So I always tell people, look, begin with sweat therapies, level off the toxins in the blood, because the sweat therapies have a leveling effect on what's in the blood without taking out everything. Some of these synthetic binders, they bind everything in the blood, they let them go. At this point, the body's throwing more from the organs. It's kind of a diffusionary process. The person gets redistribution, an increase in toxins in the blood. I see it in the hair test, and they get sick. They're out of commission for a couple of weeks and no more detox. So how to avoid that? Just start off with sweat therapies. Start off with sweat therapies. And then once you're sweating, you get the excretory processes mobilized in the body. You open up the excretory pathways in the body, and the body begins detoxing in a normal avenue, a normal way that it normally does. Because if you go back 2,000 years, you'll find people who lived on the coast and ate nothing but seafood. Their hair samples still had high levels of mercury because mercury's been around forever. So our bodies are very capable of getting rid of toxins that have been around a while, and a lot of the toxins that haven't been around in a while, for a while, because through sweat therapy. So that's the first one. And it's been around 2,000 years. People have been, you get these hot houses, or you get these sweat lodges, or there's like a test Macau I did here in Panama, where you get together, and you're sitting in this sweat tent for 3 hours and banging drums or whatever. I did it. It was good fun for just a little while. I got out. I was a bit I had suffered from heat stroke, and I was kind of like, oh my God, I could go for an ice cold beer. But, getting into that, sweat therapies. Beyond that, recommend intestinal binders. So you have your chlorella spirulina, your zeolites, and so on. And then the last stage is liposomal glutathione, which is kind of the big, heavy-duty detox where you're aggressively binding the remaining toxins that are in the body, and you're really increasing the level of detoxifying in the body at more rapid rate, but lesser amounts of toxins overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the part before you talked about silica and being in beer, and you can you can do a beer detox.
Right.
That's probably what I'm going to be doing, a beer talk, watching the World Cup finals, probably next week.
Oh, well, yeah, we can talk about that.
Yeah, I love that. But I'm not saying go drink a case of beer to detox aluminum. But yeah, there's so many different nutrients our body needs to detox, and I think a lot of people aren't detoxing very well, or don't have toxins coming out in their hair or other testing, because our body just doesn't have the raw materials to do it. I think a lot of the toxins we have in our body, we're using up our natural the antioxidants in our food, and the glutathione our liver makes. It's all getting used up just to try to clean house a little bit, our endogenous toxins that we make as well, and our body needs extra help.
100%. I could not agree more. You're spot on with the way that works. So in other words, if all of your nutrition is contributing just to maintain a certain amount of detoxification continually, you're just going to not get the nutrition you need to sustain regular metabolic function. And boy, isn't that just the way it is in most people today in the United States?
Yeah. So Dr. McGraw, thanks so much for coming on the show. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about regarding aluminum that you wanted to add?
The only other thing I would say is that, there are so many studies. If you wanted to get into this and look at studies on PubMed, I don't think people should become intimidated, because there are abstracts and summaries of studies. And if you look at my book as well as the book of other people, if you want to know the value of a good detox book, just look at the end and you'll see all the sources where people list all the, avenues of information that you can get. If you really want to know the story, you can go back into the research papers. They're in my book. They're in other books about detox. You can go back to the original sources of the peer-reviewed scientific papers where they conducted studies, and they shown repeatedly, decade after decade, this is how aluminum gets into the body. This is how it gets out of the body. This is what to do. And of course, we summarize all these things. You summarize these things on podcasts so people can listen to them on the go. It's such an incredible, valuable service that you provide because people don't have time to read books like I do. And of course, I'm just this science nerd. But how do they get that information? Through the podcast. But if they wanted to take it to the next level and go back to the research papers, I encourage people to try and do that, to try to go to that level if they have any questions, to go back to the original sources. But I know most people just don't have the time. And, people are listening to podcasts on the iPod on the go and wherever they are, I see them and I know that that's how they get their information. And that's just amazing. I think it's awesome what you're doing for people. I've looked at many of your podcasts and wow, just think about the amount of information and the lives that you're helping and the lives that you're saving by providing this in an avenue where people can quickly absorb it. It's just awesome.
Yeah, no, and it really, I've been doing this for 10 years and it still gets my juices flowing because the more research you read and the more podcasts you listen to it, the more it just lights a fire under your ass to get in your sauna, Because sometimes you just don't want to do this stuff. I mean, it's time consuming and it's not always fun and you get tired sometimes after the sauna, but you really do need a reminder sometimes to keep living that detox lifestyle because we do have such a huge threat in our environment and there is so much upside and benefit to taking these supplements and doing saunas on ionic foot baths, etc.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I find that my clients that don't sweat when they come to me and they say, I tell it's a great place to start is infrared saunas or any saunas. I had one client that wanted to sit in the car with the heater on. I told you, I don't care if you want to do yard work and Panama, it's so hot, you sweat. However you want to sweat, I don't care. Just begin sweating. And if they come in and tell me that, well, I don't sweat, I'm not a sweater, automatically I know we're in big trouble when they're coming in with chronic disease conditions. Because if you're not sweating, you're eliminating one of the major avenues in your body of getting rid of trash because they call the skin the third kidney for a reason, because it doesn't become so much toxic like our regular kidneys do, because kidneys, 80% of all the heavy metals stored in the kidney, stored in the liver. These are the organs responsible for detoxification. So you may get into this situation where you're in a lot of trouble and your organs aren't in good shape because they're toxic from the heavy metals, and those organs are responsible for the ones getting rid of the heavy metals. What do? Well, you go to your third kidney, which is the skin, and you sweat out a lot of the garbage, detoxing the organs through that pathway, along with taking glutathione and getting rid of the toxins bound to the gastrointestinal tract. And that's how people can get out of that mess that they can find themselves in by having damaged detox organs of the kidney and the liver. So I guess that's my final word.
Yes. And, I didn't sweat either when I first started doing saunas. And I think I had years of putting conventional lotions on my skin, just kind of clogging up my pores and,
Sure.
just, some people they just kind of, their skin gets very congested or that maybe they don't exfoliate enough or just something's going on but you need to get into a hot environment and you're going to start sweating. If your sauna is hot enough, you're going to sweat.
It's an acclimation